Her rejection of gears, her refusal to carry a comfortable luggage kit, her absolute insistence on riding through broken ribs. None of it was accidental. It was a conscious philosophical choice to remain entirely vulnerable to the landscape.
You just heard Notebook LM, an AI-powered research tool from Google summarizing the philosophy of Irish traveler and author Dervla Murphy. I'm told that's a Limerick accent, but I will stop using it out of respect for our Irish listeners. Dervla Murphy died in 2022 at the age of 90. Since I didn't get a chance to interview her, but have long been fascinated by her story, I've turned to AI to help me unpack the legacy of Dervla's 5 decades spent documenting her global expeditions, beginning with her 1965 book Full Tilt, which details her solo journeys from Dunkirk to Delhi aboard her beloved bicycle, Roz. Because the bicycle allowed Dervla to see the world as it truly was, she described it as an instrument of discovery.
You're listening to The Accidental Bicycle Tourist. In this podcast, you'll meet people from all walks of life and learn about their most memorable bike touring experiences. This is your host, Gabriel Aldaz.
Hello, bicycle touring enthusiasts. Welcome to another experimental episode of the Accidental Bicycle Tourist podcast. Some of you faithful listeners might recall an earlier AI-assisted episode, Top 3 Touring Debates with Gemini AI, and its quirky guests, Rambler and Scout. This one is different. It is based on a modern instrument of discovery, a program called Notebook LM, which puts AI to work analyzing only content that I supply. For this episode, I provided Dervla's books in PDF and EPUB format, interviews with Dervla on YouTube, and web pages about Dervla. Lastly, I included a sample episode of the podcast in MP3 format. My challenge was to convert Notebook LM's many types of output into something that would sound like the Accidental Bicycle Tourist podcast. First, I prompted Notebook LM to create a podcast episode transcript in the style of the Accidental Bicycle Tourist, where I interviewed an imaginary expert on Dervla, affectionately named LM, about her life and travels. The result had nice touches, even giving directions like upbeat acoustic guitar theme music fades in. But it wasn't nearly long enough. Another Notebook LM output is called a deep dive audio overview, which is billed as, quote, a lively conversation between two hosts unpacking and connecting topics in your sources. This is how that output sounded.
She wasn't an imperial conqueror passing through in a motorcade. She was a dusty, exhausted woman on a heavy bike.
The locals recognize that.
Exactly.
Nice, but it had nothing to do with me or the podcast. So, I manually combined the transcripts of the two outputs to create the final episode transcript, making minor changes and correcting a few factual errors. I fed this transcript into an AI voice generation platform called 11 Labs, which allowed me to choose from a multitude of different voices and accents for the narrators of the text. Since Dervla was Irish, I chose a male voice with an Irish accent for LM, the expert, and a female voice with a light Irish accent for the quotes read from Dervla's books and articles. Of course, I wanted to see if my own voice could also be decently replicated, a process known as voice cloning. The training samples can be provided via a sound file or live recorded into the program. I provided an hour-long sound file with my speech. The 11 Labs tool has a safety feature to prevent cloning somebody else's voice without their consent. Thus, I had to read a sentence that popped up on screen to verify my voice. Unfortunately, I happened to have a cold at that time, so the verification failed day after day. As a last resort, I recorded myself reading for 1 hour with a cold, and then the verification succeeded at last. The episode you're about to hear is nearly 100% AI generated. If it sounds like I have a cold, blame it on the quiet, predictable dampness of rural Ireland. Hello, cycle touring enthusiasts. Today we are taking a deep dive into the life of a woman who didn't just tour, she redefined the very meaning of adventure. I'm talking about the legendary Irish traveler and author Dervla Murphy. Joining me today is an expert, Notebook LM, who has put a lot of effort into studying Murphy's 20-plus books and her incredible 90-year journey on this earth. LM, if I may call you that, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Gabriel. Dervla was truly one of a kind.
Let's start at the beginning. Most of our guests have a random act or a crazy coincidence that gets them into touring. Was Dervla's start accidental?
In a way, it was a coincidence of gifts. It's December 1941, right in the middle of the war. Dervla has just turned 10 years old. The world is tearing itself apart, but in rural Ireland, a different kind of ignition is taking place. Her grandfather sends her a second-hand atlas as a birthday gift, and her parents scrape together enough to buy her a second-hand bicycle. And this is the inciting incident of her entire existence. She takes this heavy second-hand bike out onto a steep hill near her home. She is struggling, pushing the pedals with all her 10-year-old might, and she looks down at her legs pumping up and down.
And something clicks.
In that moment, her brain makes a purely logical, almost mathematical deduction. She realizes the mechanics of the machine. One pedal stroke pushes you forward a few feet, and therefore if she simply repeats that exact same motion a sufficient number of times, there is no geographic limit to where she can go. She concludes right there on that hill that if she just keeps pushing, she could reach India.
That's quite a revelation for a 10-year-old.
And the most crucial detail is that she does not treat this as a fairy tale. She doesn't view it as a game of pretend. She goes home, opens the atlas her grandfather gave her, and literally traces the route. She starts doing the math. She calculates the land masses. She realizes she can take a ferry to Europe, right across France, Germany, the Balkans, through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, and over the Himalayas down into the Indian subcontinent. In her mind, the trip is already a concrete reality. It is just a matter of waiting for the right time.
The foreword of her first and most famous book, Full Tilt, begins with the following sentence.
On my 10th birthday, a bicycle and an atlas coincided as presents, and a few days later, I decided to cycle to India.
I think this is one of the great opening lines of travel writing. In the foreword, Dervla goes on to say that she was a cunning child. She guards her plan fiercely. She makes a conscious decision to keep this ambition a total absolute secret from the adults in her life. She wrote later that she knew exactly how adults operate.
As an adult, you just dismiss it.
Right. If she told them she was going to cycle to India, they wouldn't yell at her or forbid it. They would employ what she called tolerant amusement. They would give her that patronizing, dismissive adult smile that brushes away a child's grandest dreams as mere fantasy.
Again, that's so perceptive.
She knew that tolerant amusement was far more corrosive than active opposition. She refused to let their condescension dilute her certainty, so she keeps it a secret for 20 years.
20 years is a long time to wait. What kept her?
To answer that question, we need to travel back in time to Lismore, County Waterford, Ireland. The year is 1931. Dervla Murphy is born into a household that is rich in intellect, but soon overshadowed by physical suffering.
It's a tough start.
Her father is the county librarian. Her home is utterly saturated with books, atlases, ideas, and her father's massive collection of 78 RPM records. It's an environment primed for curiosity. But when Dervla is just 1 year old, her mother develops a brutally severe form of rheumatoid arthritis. It was a progressive crippling disease. Within a few years, Dervla's mother became entirely bedridden, a complete invalid.
How did the family cope?
They hired housekeeping help. They sent Dervla to the Ursuline Convent boarding school in Waterford. But it's not working. Her parents continue to struggle. As Dervla wrote in her autobiographic account of her early life, Wheels Within Wheels, by age 14 she is physically fully grown and totally self-centered. She likes to spend her time idling in Waterford and shrinks from mental or emotional suffering. She returns home for the Easter holidays And everything changes during a family conference on Good Friday evening. In Wheels Within Wheels, Dervla writes,
My mother had an orderly mind, and on occasions like this could give an impression of coldness, as she suppressed her feelings to leave the way clear for logical argument. There were, she said, only 3 possible courses. We could struggle on as we were, we could accept the fact that I must remain formally uneducated, or she and I could rent Uncle Bob's basement flat at Orwell Park, leaving my father to live alone in Lismore.
Incredibly, Dervla is allowed to choose the path for the family. Immediately and emphatically, Dervla decides to leave formal education entirely to become her mother's full-time caregiver. And Dervla was an only child.
It is a staggering level of responsibility to place on a child.
Precisely. As she grew, the immense weight of running the household and providing round-the-clock medical care fell squarely onto her very young shoulders. So it is a sense of duty that delays her departure. She is physically tethered to that house in Lismore, but she never stops dreaming of India. She knows that a trip of that magnitude is going to require more than just enthusiasm. She comes to accept that it's going to require an immense capacity to suffer. Here's where it gets really interesting, because her preparation is completely unorthodox.
How's that?
She doesn't just ride her bike a lot. She actively begins to physically and psychologically condition her own nervous system to endure agony. The stories of her childhood preparation are almost disturbing in their intensity. She would intentionally plunge her feet into scalding hot water, holding them there while they burned to teach her brain how to process and ignore intense physical pain.
That's just wild.
She would take pieces of heavy string, wrap them tightly around her fingers and pull them tighter and tighter, cutting off circulation and digging into the flesh, conditioning her mind to detach from the sensation.
See, I have to push back on this because if I heard about a teenager today secretly scalding her feet in boiling water and torturing her fingers with string, I wouldn't call that preparation. I would call that a profound trauma response.
I can see why you'd say that.
Is it possible that the immense psychological pressure of watching her mother's body deteriorate and the claustrophobia of her caregiving duties just broke something in her? Was she actually brave, or was she just deeply traumatized and dissociating from her reality?
That is a highly perceptive question, and it cuts to the core of who Dervla Murphy was. If you asked Dervla, she would vehemently reject the word traumatized. And interestingly, she also heavily rejected the word brave.
Really? Why wouldn't she consider herself brave?
She drew a very sharp philosophical distinction between bravery and fearlessness. To Dervla, bravery implies that an individual feels terror, feels the biological urge to flee, but uses their willpower to overcome that fear and act anyway. Bravery is a constant, exhausting battle against your own nervous system.
Bravery requires fear as a prerequisite.
Exactly. Dervla claimed she simply trained herself to be fearless. She systematically dismantled her own anticipatory anxiety. She realized that feeling fear before a danger occurs is biologically useless. It just drains your energy.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
She trained her prefrontal cortex to override her amygdala. By exposing herself to controlled pain with the hot water and the string, she was learning how to decouple the physical sensation from the emotional panic. Her logic was pristine. If a wolf is not currently actively biting my leg, there is absolutely no utility in fearing the wolf. She refused to suffer a moment before it was strictly necessary.
Very pragmatic.
That's a psychological superpower, and we have to acknowledge the strange paradox of her environment. The person who inadvertently fueled this radical mobility was her mother. Her mother was physically immobilized, trapped in a bed, her joints ravaged by arthritis. Yet she did not try to keep Dervla trapped with her. She actively pushed Dervla out the door. When Dervla was 17, her mother encouraged her to take solo multi-week cycle tours across Wales and southern England. She told her daughter to go look at the world. It is a beautiful testament to her mother's character. She refused to let her own physical prison become her daughter's psychological prison, but the reality remained. Dervla was the primary caregiver.
She stayed in Lismore.
She washed, she cooked, she administered medicine, she lifted her mother in and out of bed. She spent her 20s frustrated, physically, intellectually, and socially, longing to travel but confined to a shared bedroom with her mother, often never getting an unbroken night's sleep for years. When her mother finally passes away in 1962, Dervla is 30 years old. She is undoubtedly grieving the loss of her mother, but simultaneously feels a sense of enormous exhilaration and release. The powerful anchor that has held her in place for nearly 2 decades is abruptly lifted. She is entirely, perhaps jarringly, liberated from her domestic duties, and she doesn't waste any time. Carrying the intense psychological armor she forged as a child, she finally moves to execute the plan. Just 5 months later, on January 14th, 1963, Dervla Murphy stands at the docks in Dunkirk, France. She points her front tire east, and she pedals directly into what historians record as one of the most brutal, deeply freezing winters in European history.
What a way to start the trip.
Indeed. And here we have to talk about the mechanics of this trip, because her gear choices fundamentally defy modern logic. Her partner for this crossing is a bicycle she affectionately named Rosinante, or Roz, after Don Quixote's famously dilapidated horse.
A great name.
Roz is not a high-tech expedition machine. It is a stock Armstrong Cadet men's bicycle, and she begins this journey on Roz's second birthday. Now, if you or I were about to cycle across the mountains of Afghanistan, we would take our bike to a mechanic and upgrade every single component.
Of course.
We'd want the widest gear range possible.
When in doubt, get more gears, right?
Dervla does the exact opposite. She deliberately downgrades the bicycle from a 3-speed. She took it to a mechanic and ordered them to completely remove the derailleur and extra gears. She converted Roz into a single-speed, direct-drive bicycle.
Wait, really? She intentionally removed the gears before crossing the Himalayas?
Yes, she did.
That sounds like a fundamental misunderstanding of physics. Why would you deny yourself mechanical advantage on the tallest mountain range on Earth?
Because her understanding of mechanics was actually incredibly advanced, and it was rooted in pure pragmatism. You have to understand what derailleurs were like in the early 1960s. They were fragile metal cages that hung down perilously close to the ground, relying on delicate cable tension to move the chain. Dervla knew that the roads in rural Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan would be unpaved, filled with deep ruts, thick mud, and loose rocks.
Right.
One stray rock kicks up and bends that derailleur cage, and your bike is permanently disabled. If that happens in a remote Afghan mountain pass in 1963, your journey is over. There are no bike shops. But a single-speed drivetrain, it's practically indestructible. The chain runs straight from the front ring to a single rear cog. It is thick, robust, and has no lateral movement.
It's bomb-proof.
Exactly. If a single-speed chain somehow breaks, you can use a simple punch tool and a rock to pop a pin out, remove the broken link, snap it back together, and keep riding. Dervla believed that complexity was a liability. She preferred a simple, primitive machine, fully accepting that she would have to rely entirely on her own raw muscular strength to push it over the mountains.
It's the ultimate expression of self-reliance.
It's like a modern backpacker intentionally throwing their GPS satellite communicator into a river and relying on a compass just to guarantee they have to engage with the landscape.
Yes.
And her packing list reflects that exact same militant minimalism. Her entire kit for a 6-month transcontinental journey weighed 28 pounds. She brought a spare shirt, some nylon pants, a comb, a compass, a map, and a volume of William Blake's poetry. She described herself as a light packer, which was important because she frequently carried Roz around her neck while climbing through the Karakoram Mountains.
Impressive.
Oh, almost forgot. In the pocket of her slacks, she kept a .25 caliber pistol. She practiced firing and reloading it in the mountains of Lismore before she left.
It seems like a gun of some kind was standard equipment for touring back then. As described in the episode The Accidental Origins of Bicycle Touring with David Houghton, Thomas Stevens and Annie Londonderry were both packing heat.
As you'll hear, she actually had to draw her gun a couple of times, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. We've established that Dervla was very pragmatic, and she would need every ounce of that pragmatism and that staggering pain tolerance she developed as a child. As we said, the European winter of 1963 was legendary for its severity. She writes in full tilt about cycling up to a youth hostel in Rouen, France, with a literal 1/4-inch icicle frozen firmly to her nose.
Ugh, miserable.
Her hands were so painfully cold she would weep as the blood returned to her frozen fingers. By the time she reaches the Yugoslavian border, a female border guard looks at the scruffy, freezing Irish woman with a loaded pistol and a loaf of bread sticking out of her pocket and just laughs in sheer astonishment. But the cold was the least of her problems when she got further east. In Yugoslavia, the wildlife became a genuine threat. She is actually stalked and attacked by a pack of hungry wolves while riding through a snowy forest. That's the first time she has to use her pistol. She shoots 2 of them dead. The second time is in Iran, when she uses that same pistol to frighten off a group of highway thieves. And in one truly harrowing incident in Persian Azerbaijan, a young police officer escorts her to the police barracks, where he attempts to rape her. Dervla deploys tactics that are vaguely described in the book.
As my adversary was armed with a revolver, I kept my gun in my pocket and used unprintable tactics to reduce him to a state of temporary agony.
She finally sold the gun in Afghanistan, jokingly calling herself an arms trader.
Good thing she kept her sense of humor as she navigated an incredibly hostile gauntlet.
Yes, but the most grueling physical tests of the entire expedition didn't come from wolves or thieves. It occurred in Afghanistan in an event she casually referred to as the rifle butt incident. This is where the childhood conditioning really comes into play. She's taking a rare brief bus ride to bypass a totally unnavigable section of road in Afghanistan. The bus is overcrowded, tensions are high, and a violent brawl breaks out among the passengers over bus fares. In the claustrophobic chaos of the aisle, someone swings a heavy wooden rifle and the butt of the rifle strikes Dervla squarely in the chest.
Oof.
The impact severely fractured 3 of her ribs. Now, we need to understand the physiological reality of cycling with fractured ribs.
It sounds impossible.
It's excruciating. At altitude, as she was approaching the Himalayas, the air is thin. The body demands maximum oxygen, which means deep, expansive, desperate breaths. Every single time the lungs expand, the rib cage flexes, grinding those fractured bone edges together.
I can't even imagine.
Furthermore, when you cycle up a mountain, you aren't just using your legs, you are pulling up on the handlebars with your arms, engaging your entire core. Every bump in the road sends a kinetic shockwave up the rigid steel fork of the bicycle through the arms and directly into the shattered chest wall. Most people will go to an embassy, wire home for cash, and get on a flight back to Dublin.
What does Dervla do?
She rests for a pitifully short amount of time and gets back on her single-speed bicycle, later joking that such an incident was no worse than a drunken brawl in Ireland involving a hurling stick. Dervla pushes the bike through the blistering heat of the Tangusharo Gorge. She rides up into the dizzying, oxygen-starved altitudes of the Himalayas, enduring unimaginable continuous agony. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this exact moment is where Dervla's philosophical framework becomes crystal clear. It wasn't just stubbornness, it was a practiced ideology. In the foreword to Full Tilt, she deliberately quotes the ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus. She writes,
For it is not death or hardship that is a fearful thing, but the fear of death and hardship.
Her rejection of gears, her refusal to carry a comfortable luggage kit, her absolute insistence on riding through broken ribs, none of it was accidental. It was a conscious philosophical choice to remain entirely vulnerable to the landscape. She believed that modern technology, exemplified by closed motorized vehicles, created a barrier between the human and the earth. She wanted to feel the topography and her muscles and bones, rather than conquering it with engineering. And here's the beautiful payoff to that vulnerability. Because she refused to armor herself, she experienced the most profound, overwhelming hospitality from the local populations. She wasn't an imperial conqueror passing through in a motorcade. She was a dusty, exhausted woman on a heavy bike.
The locals recognize that.
Exactly. There's this incredibly evocative moment she describes. She is pushing through a high mountain pass, utterly exhausted. She lays down on the rocky ground, baking in the intense mountain sun, and falls asleep. Sometime later, she wakes up expecting to be sunburned, but finds herself in deep, cool shade. A group of local Kochi nomads, recognizing how vulnerable she was, had silently crept up while she was sleeping. They had erected a massive goat hair tent directly over her head to protect her from the sun, and they did it with such precision and care that they didn't even wake her or displace a single pebble. It perfectly encapsulates her central thesis that the vast majority of humanity, regardless of culture or religion, is inherently good and eager to help a vulnerable stranger. When you present yourself without defenses, people generally respond with care. They are helpful and honest, which is the opposite of the impression you get from the headlines.
That's a recurring theme on this podcast.
She contrasts that beautiful silent moment with the nomads against a genuinely hilarious run-in she has with an American tourist a few days later. She's pushing her bike up the scorching, desolate mountain road. A cloud of dust appears and an American in a modern Jeep rolls up next to her. He rolls down the window and yells,
What the hell are you doing on this goddamn road?
He demands to know why she's out in a goddamn frying pan and tells her to throw her bike in the back of his Jeep so he can rescue her.
Just missing the point completely.
Totally. And Dervla politely declines. She thinks to herself that when you are inside a metal box with a roaring engine, the world outside looks like a hostile frying pan. But when you are on a bicycle, feeling the air, smelling the dirt, matching the pace of the landscape, it doesn't feel like a frying pan at all. It feels like the world. She finally arrived in Delhi, India, on July the 18th, 1963. It had taken her exactly 6 months to the day. She'd covered roughly 4,400 miles.
Averaging what, 70 miles a day?
between 70 and 80 miles a day on the days she was actually writing. While she was in Delhi, volunteering her time to help Tibetan refugees who had fled across the border, she met Penelope Betjeman, a prominent English traveller, and that meeting changed everything. Penelope read through Dervla's daily diary entries, which Dervla had faithfully mailed back to Ireland throughout the trip, and was utterly astounded by the clarity and the raw grit of the writing. While cycling together through a crowded old Delhi bazaar, Penelope persuades Dervla to compile them and send them to Jock Murray, a famous publisher in London. In Wheels Within Wheels, Dervla writes,
I was so profoundly shocked by this irreverent suggestion that I almost ran into a sacred cow.
After further prodding by Penelope, Dervla mails the manuscript to John Murray, as Jock is formally called, and a few days later receives a telegram signed by Jock himself, asking for a meeting in London.
Those were the days.
John Murray published the manuscript as Full Tilt in 1965, and it instantly became a massive, generation-defining classic of travel literature. She then wrote 2 more books about her experiences helping Tibetan refugees.
After India and Tibet, she didn't just stop, did she?
Not at all. Now a celebrated author, Dervla trekked through Ethiopia with a pack mule named Jock.
What a sense of humor.
Dervla's journey is recorded in her 4th book, In Ethiopia with a Mule. She has clearly mastered the art of the tough, uncompromising lone wolf traveller. She's proven her childhood thesis. But the next chapter of her life forced her to radically, fundamentally alter that solitary style. Because in 1968, at the age of 37, Dervla Murphy gave birth to her daughter Rachel. We have to pause and definitely contextualize this fact. Being an unmarried single mother in rural, highly Catholic Ireland in the late 1960s was not just frowned upon, it was intensely scandalous. This was an era when women in Ireland faced immense social ostracization for pregnancies outside of marriage. It was a profoundly defiant choice on Dervla's part. But Dervla wrote that she felt uniquely protected from the harshest social judgments. She was older, 37, she was fiercely independent. And crucially, she had achieved absolute financial security through the massive success of her books. She didn't need society's approval to survive.
Most people would assume that having a child marks the end of the adventuring days.
Right. You buy a sensible car. You settle into the house in Lismore. You write fiction from a comfortable desk. Dervla did not do that. Instead of stopping her travels, she simply absorbed Rachel into them. By the time Rachel is 5 years old, Dervla decides it's time for her to see the world and takes her on a major trip to India. Next, they took a winter journey to Baltistan, documented in Where the Indus is Young, which involved extreme conditions. Dervla recalled that at one point in the middle of winter, neither she nor Rachel took their clothes off for 3 months due to temperatures dropping to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is also negative 40 degrees Celsius. Over the subsequent years, this mother-daughter duo travels to the high Andes of Peru, to the remote corners of Madagascar, and to Cameroon.
Wow.
The Cameroon trip is particularly iconic because they traverse the country with a famously stubborn pack horse named Egbert, carrying their minimal gear. The journey through Cameroon also produced one of her most famous and culturally revealing anecdotes. They were travelling deep into remote areas where the local societal structures were deeply traditional. The local people simply could not fathom the concept of a woman travelling completely alone with a young child, entirely devoid of a male protector.
It just didn't compute for them.
Right, it defied their entire cultural understanding of how the world operated. So looking at Dervla with her closely cropped hair, her skin weathered by decades of sun and wind, her broad shoulders and her tough, authoritative demeanour, the locals made the most logical deduction available to them. They assumed that Dervla must actually be a man, and therefore must be Rachel's husband.
That is such a funny misunderstanding.
And Dervla, being arguably the most pragmatic human being to ever walk the earth, didn't waste time trying to argue gender politics or family structures and broken dialects. When a group of village elders insisted she was a man, she simply unbuttoned her shirt and exposed her breasts to prove her gender.
Whoa!
It's just a frank, undeniable physical testament to reality. Boom. Argument over. Now, let's move on.
So practical.
But I know what you, the listener, might be thinking right now. You are probably asking yourself the exact same question that I am. Wait a minute, doesn't bringing a 5-year-old child into remote, mountainous, potentially dangerous terrain completely contradict her whole hardcore survivalist ethos? Isn't there a line between cultural immersion and reckless endangerment? How did she justify taking a toddler into regions with zero medical infrastructure?
Good question.
It is a vital question, and it was one she was frequently asked by critics. But if we analyse Dervla's writings and her underlying philosophy, We see that bringing Rachel didn't contradict her ethos at all. It actually perfected it. We have to remember that Dervla's ultimate goal was never to conquer nature.
She wasn't an adrenaline junkie.
No, she didn't care about setting athletic records or proving she was the toughest person in the room. Her primary driving goal was to connect with humanity. When a lone adult foreigner rolls into a remote, isolated village, they trigger a defensive response. They are viewed with suspicion. They are an anomaly, a curiosity, or potentially a scout for an invading force. But a mother traveling with a young child bypasses the defensive perimeter of almost every culture on Earth. A mother and child is a universal biological constant.
Ah, I see. A kid is a kid everywhere, and a mother is a mother everywhere. It translates perfectly.
Exactly, Dervla explicitly described the child as the ultimate passport. Children do not recognize the artificial boundaries of race, class, or culture. If you put two 5-year-olds together who don't speak a word of the same language, they will figure out how to play within 3 minutes. They demolish the barriers of adult shyness and suspicion.
That's beautiful.
And crucially, from a safety perspective, when a mother brings her young child into a village, it signals to the locals that she has absolute, unwavering trust in their goodwill. It is the ultimate gesture of vulnerability. And in almost every instance, it instantly triggered the local community's empathy, their deeply ingrained hospitality, and a shared sense of human responsibility to protect the child. Rachel was her greatest bridge to the people she wanted to understand.
That is brilliant. It reframes the risk entirely.
And it's important to note that it wasn't all just endless wandering. Dervla had a home, and she loved it fiercely. When they were back in Lismore, Dervla lived a deeply ascetic, grounded life. She famously refused to ever own a television, believing it destroyed the mind's ability to generate its own thoughts.
Very on brand for her.
Her house was a chaotic haven filled with dogs and cats. She wrote beautifully about her deep appreciation for the damp snail trails of her native patch of territory in County Waterford. She travelled the globe specifically to escape Western consumerism and modern homogenization, but she was profoundly rooted in her local Irish community. She was a fascinating study in contrasts. She loved the quiet, predictable dampness of rural Ireland, but as she grew older, her appetite for travel evolved. She didn't seek out pleasant Mediterranean beaches or comfortable tourist resorts for her twilight years. She actively began to pivot her focus toward the most conflicted and dangerous geopolitical fracture zones on the planet. This brings us to a complex part of our deep dive, Dervla Murphy's intense political evolution. Over the decades, she developed very sharp, uncompromising views. She was fundamentally anti-globalization and fiercely anti-NATO. She did not shy away from controversy. And it's vital to look at her time in these highly charged regions purely as an observer trying to uncover the ground-level truth. Her later books reflect her deep immersion in conflict zones. Now, obviously, I need to pause here because those are incredibly fraught topics. I want to be absolutely clear to you, the listener. My goal today isn't to validate her specific political conclusions or to take a side on the geopolitical conflicts she wrote about. I am impartially reporting on her life as detailed in her memoirs, regardless of whether her views align with left-wing or right-wing perspectives.
What are some examples of conflict zones into which she traveled?
She traveled through Northern Ireland during the absolute height of the Troubles, spending time drinking in pubs and sitting in living rooms with both Catholics and Protestants, trying to understand the root of the sectarian violence. She rode her bike into Rwanda shortly after the horrific events of the 1994 genocide to document the aftermath. She spent extensive time in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, speaking directly with supporters of both Hamas and Fatah. She sharply and loudly criticized Western NGOs operating in Africa, arguing they often did more harm than good, and she was highly critical of NATO's bombing campaigns in the Balkans during the 1990s.
Sounds like you absolutely cannot separate Dervla, the cyclist, from Dervla, the political observer. You can't just talk about the fun bicycle rides and ignore the politics because to her, the travels were the research. The bicycle was simply the methodology she used to access the political reality of a region.
Precisely. And what is most revealing about her methodology is that it was frequently dictated by complete disaster. Let's look at a specific example from 1990. The brutal communist regime of Nicolae Ceausescu has just fallen in Romania. It is a moment of massive historical upheaval. Dervla, nearing 60 years old, decides she absolutely must go there to witness the raw, post-communist reality as the country tries to rebuild itself. She takes the Orient Express train heading toward the Romanian border, but at a remote border crossing in the dead of the night, Corrupt border guards target her. They essentially shake her down and rob her. They steal her entire rucksack. That bag contained thousands of pounds worth of custom cold weather gear, her vital medicines, her specialized sleeping bag, her tent, everything she needed to survive a Romanian winter. She's left standing alone on a freezing train platform with only the clothes on her back, whatever small items were in her pockets, and a bottle of Irish whiskey she had brought along.
Let's be honest. If that happens to 99% of seasoned travelers, the trip is instantly over. You find a phone, you call the nearest embassy, you report the theft, and you get on the next flight to Dublin.
Not Dervla.
I didn't think so. What does Dervla do?
She unscrews the bottle, drinks some of the whiskey to warm her blood, buys a bottle of watered-down milk from a vendor, and just starts walking. She walks down a pitch-black, freezing road into a thick, blinding winter fog. She absolutely refuses to let the theft dictate her journey. And this leads to what I think is the most conceptually fascinating aspect of her later years, her evolving relationship with physical injury. Later on, this exact same trip, while navigating the icy streets of a city in the Moldavia region, she slips, falls hard, and breaks her foot. She is completely immobilized. She can't ride the cheap replacement bike she bought. She can't hike. She is stuck in a brutally cold, impoverished post-communist city. And in a massive cognitive reframing, she viewed this physical immobility not as a disaster, but as a distinct research advantage.
So what does this all mean? How on earth is breaking your foot an advantage when your entire identity is based on being a traveler?
I was trying to think of a way to describe this, and I realized it's like a chemical reaction. When you are moving constantly, even slowly on a bicycle, you are essentially a physical mixture. You are swirling through a culture, seeing it, touching it, but you don't fundamentally bond with it. You can always ride away. But when you break a bone and cannot move, the heat is turned up, the catalyst is added, and you are forced into a chemical reaction with the environment.
You become fundamentally bonded to the people around you.
That is exactly the dynamic she discovered. When she was highly mobile, traversing 40 miles a day, she was still, to some extent, a passing observer. The locals knew she would be gone by morning, but when her foot was broken in Moldavia, the dynamic inverted. She was forced to completely stop. She couldn't leave even if she wanted to. She had to rely entirely on the local citizens for her baseline survival, for food, for shelter, for finding a doctor, for translating the local news. Because she was stuck, she spent her days sitting in cramped apartments with local academics, helping them translate books, drinking coffee in local cafes day after day. She experienced the deep, mundane, grinding daily realities and the specific economic anxieties of post-communist life. Insights she never would have gotten otherwise.
So these were profound insights that a swiftly passing cyclist, no matter how observant, would completely miss.
Exactly. Her injuries forced her into a state of total reliance, which yielded unparalleled research. And once she realized the value of immobility, she embraced it constantly.
Seems like another paradox given her desperation to escape Lismore during her early years.
You're right. On the surface, it looks like a contradiction. I think the point is, if you can't be fully immobile and immerse yourself in a culture, the next best thing is to reduce your speed. Walk, bicycle, ride on a horse or a donkey or a camel. That's also a way Dervla possessed a passionate, almost visceral hatred for motorcars and the speed at which they travelled. She believed they fostered instant gratification and destroyed the environment. She never owned one. Dervla preferred the bicycle because it provided a sensory experience that cars or planes could not, allowing her to see, smell, and feel everything around her. She also hated the paving of motor roads, believing that they led to beautiful, handcrafted goods being replaced with mass-produced junk, and ultimately destroyed humanity's organic, biological sense of time.
Dervla had a lot of opinions that she shared with her readers.
Absolutely. For instance, she despised the word tourist. She practiced serious travel, which she defined as being alone and completely cut off from home and family. Here is a passage from Dervla's 1992 article, Footnotes, Reflections on Travel Writing.
By contrast with the traveller, whose rewards are hard-won, the tourist merely pays for a privilege that is inexorably destroyed by being attained, and destroyed for everyone. Hence, the travellers sulk impotently when our natural habitat is invaded by jeeploads of consumers. And we feel remorseful if, as writers and photographers, we have helped to draw attention to hitherto little-known regions. Tourism is intrinsically incompatible with travelling. The traveller's rewards are natural beauty and silence, space, solitude, and also, no less importantly, spontaneous human-to-human contact with the locals, free of exploitation on either side. The traveller merges temporarily with a region and its people, as tourists cannot do.
Just to clarify, whenever I refer to accidental bicycle tourists, I mean tourist in the sense of someone who undertakes a bicycle tour, not Dervla's negative definition of ignorant, entitled, and disrespectful visitors. I see where Dervla is coming from, but I'm not sure I agree that her way of travel is so superior. Isn't Dervla the traveler, by drawing attention to hitherto little-known regions, as she calls them, merely taking the first of many steps that will transform pristine areas into the mass tourist attractions that she loathed?
Dervla was acutely conscious of this paradox, often expressing grief that the intrusion of modern roads and globalization, fostered in part by the attention drawn through travel writing, was diluting local cultures and preventing future generations from seeing these areas as truly unspoilt. To achieve a state of radical isolation, she chose to fully immerse herself in the present moment. Once Dervla even implemented a travel strategy called the Mystery Tour.
What's a mystery tour?
She put this into practice for her 60th birthday in 1992. After buying a fancy Dawes Ascent mountain bike named Lear and a ticket to Nairobi, she told everyone only that she was embarking on a 4-month mystery tour. She wasn't going to share any details with anybody during her journey, which eventually took her from Kenya to Zimbabwe, via Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia.
Lear! Do we know what happened to Roz?
After her trek to India ended, she brought the dismantled bicycle back to Ireland as personal effects in 1964. In her later life, she kept Roz in retirement at her home. She noted that although the bicycle still functioned, she would not trust it for a journey of more than a few miles. Eventually, Dervla donated Roz to the Lismore Library, where her father had worked for so many years.
Amazing! That really is bringing things full circle.
Yep.
Still, even in her 70s and 80s, she was still out there, right?
In 2002, she is 71 years old. She decides to travel to the far eastern reaches of Russia, deep into Siberia. While there, she suffers a terrible fall, breaking her knee and completely tearing a calf muscle.
The pain must have been blinding.
But does she call for an air evac? No, she just pivots her methodology. She adapts. She can't cycle, so she continues her journey through the vastness of Siberia by taking local trains, hitching rides on cargo boats, and squeezing onto rural buses. She hobbles along on crutches, continuing to observe, continuing to take notes, continuing to write. Her account became the book, Through Siberia by Accident.
She was, in the truest sense of the word, unstoppable.
Her curiosity was always vastly more powerful than her physical pain. This raises an important question about how we view modern travel today. Dervla was deeply, vocally dismayed by what travel had become in the 21st century. She would see young backpackers in incredibly remote, beautiful locations sitting in hostels with earbuds firmly in their ears, constantly looking down at screens, calling or texting home to assure their parents they were safe. She felt they were totally disconnected from where they actually were. They were missing the point entirely. As we touched upon earlier, to Dervla, true travel requires the total severing of the umbilical cord to your home culture. You have to experience the friction of being lost, the terror of being robbed, or the vulnerability of being broken in order to genuinely, desperately need the people around you. If you always have a digital safety net in your pocket, if you can always summon an Uber or look up a translation, you never truly have to trust the stranger standing directly in front of you. You never have to engage in the messy, beautiful reality of human dependence.
It is so convincing. I mean, so many people stare at their digital maps, desperately trying to ensure they never make a wrong turn, while she built her entire life on the premise that the wrong turn is where the actual world begins.
She lived a life of absolute, uncompromising, fierce engagement with the world until she finally passed away in 2022 at the phenomenal age of 90. She saw the world exactly on her own terms, from the freezing peaks of the Himalayas to the damp snail trails of Lismore. To summarize her incredible legacy, we have to recognize that Dervla Murphy's vulnerability was deeply intentional, honed from childhood. From her beloved Roz to her modern mountain bike, the bicycle is far more than a simple machine for transportation. In the right hands, it is a tool for liberation, a destroyer of cultural barriers, and the ultimate engine of human empathy. It forces you out of the protective armor of a climate-controlled car. It strips away your speed and it puts you face to face, moving at a human pace, with the elements and the people who live in them.
What a powerful legacy. Dervla Murphy didn't just ride a bike. She used it as an instrument of discovery to see the world as it truly was.
Well put. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over today as you go about your routine. In our modern era, we are absolutely terrified of being disconnected. We rely on GPS satellites to tell us exactly where we are at all times. We rely on smartphones to translate the world for us, and we demand constant digital updates to assure ourselves we are safe. We have systematically engineered all the vulnerability out of the travel experience. So here's the question for you. The next time you leave your house, whether you are getting on a bicycle or just going for a walk in a neighborhood you've never visited before, what would happen if you intentionally left your phone on the kitchen counter? If you had absolutely no way to contact home, no digital map to guide you, and no glowing screen to hide behind when you felt awkward or lost, would you find the world to be infinitely more dangerous? Or like Dervla Murphy did, time and time again, would you find it infinitely more welcoming? It's something to think about the next time you find yourself desperately wishing for a map, when maybe what you really need is to pack light, strip away the gears, and just start pedaling.
Looks like I'll soon be out of a job, and I don't even have one. I must say, Notebook LM uncovered some interesting nuggets about Dervla's life and philosophy. One of my criticisms of the previous AI episode was that Scout and Rambler were always so positive and eager to please. In this episode too, LM seems to hold Dervla in the highest esteem and quickly downplays any criticisms. I would have expected an expert to have a more balanced view on his subject. Just as the previous AI episode with Scout and Rambler took an unexpected turn, so did this one. AI just urged us to leave our technology at home, which is astonishing because AI currently depends heavily on us using that very technology. AI's development, training, and improvement are anchored in human action. Dervla Murphy likely would have viewed AI with skepticism. She argued that scientific advances were ultimately tragic because they caused millions to lead, quote, feebler and more synthetic lives. Remember, according to her, the television destroyed the mind's ability to generate its own thoughts. With the proliferation of AI-generated content, including hyper-personalized feeds, voice clones, and deepfakes, quickly leading to fragmentation of shared human reality, Dervla's primary driving goal of humanity connecting through unfiltered face-to-face interaction seems more relevant than ever. The transcript for this episode is available on the Accidental Bicycle Tourist website. I welcome feedback and suggestions for this and other episodes. You'll find a link to all contact information in the show notes. If you would like to rate or review the show, you can do that on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow the podcast on Instagram. Thank you to Anna Lindenmeyer for the cover artwork and to Timothy Shurtell for the original music. This podcast would not be possible without continuous support from my wife, Sandra. And thank you so much for listening. I hope the episode will inspire you to get out and see where the road leads you.
She is actually stalked and attacked by a pack of hungry wolves while riding through a snowy forest. That's the first time she has to use her pistol, firing warning shots to scare them off.
Actually, LM, she shot the first animal through the skull and the second one in the ribs.